This is Sudden Impact. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Sudden Impact. Normally, I'd bring you the news about TNA Wrestling, but in this episode and series of episodes, I'm going to be doing something different. So I'm going to be discussing questions that I think need to be looked at a little bit further, and questions about what TNA should do to make themselves more ready for the future and basically ready for the future. So without further ado, let's get started. So in this particular episode, I am discussing whether TNA needs a proper developmental territory. So with the success of WWE's developmental territory, NXT, which develops homegrown talent and wrestlers from outside the WWE and gets them prepared for working in the WWE style, which wrestlers have gone on to say that has benefited them because with AJ Styles, he debuted from New Japan immediately onto the main roster of WWE in the at the Royal Rumble pay-per-view in 2016. But he went on to say that he would have preferred to have spent time in NXT just developing that WWE style of wrestling. Now, I'm not saying that he didn't take to the WWE style of wrestling really well, but which he's just phenomenal, and that's why he's called the Phenomenal One. But he himself said that he would have preferred to go to NXT first, just to ease into the WWE style of working. So, with all that said, the main reason why NXT has been successful for WWE is because it is solely a WWE creation, and it is owned by WWE. So, WWE previously took developmental territories. Used developmental territories that were already wrestling companies that existed, such as Heartland Wrestling Association, Deep South Wrestling, Florida Championship Wrestling, and Ohio Valley Wrestling. And they would send their younger, more inexperienced wrestlers to those companies to get familiar with the WWE style of working. But those companies were not the best in terms of the facilities and that they offered. So in 2012, the decision was made to centralize the developmental system and bring it into the WWE umbrella. So that's what they did and created NXT from the ashes of Florida Championship Wrestling. So this proved to be very successful, as the majority of the wrestlers who graduated from NXT and went on to work on Raw or SmackDown have had successful runs, winning multiple championships. I think most of the champions now in WWE's main roster are former NXT graduates. And that speaks volumes to the success of the NXT system. So, and NXT actually became so successful that for a brief time, it was also considered to be the third brand and running its own live events and pay-per-view events as well. So saying all this, TNA did have their own developmental territories, namely Ohio Valley Wrestling and Border City Wrestling. So it was pretty much this. They followed this similar system that the WWE did initially, with sending their inexperienced wrestlers to OVW or BCW just to get more familiar with working in the TNA style of wrestling. But again, this hasn't been done. They haven't actually called up wrestlers from OVW like straight up. So OVW has its own roster of wrestlers, and then TNA would send a few of their inexperienced wrestlers to them just to get that experience, like I said. But then they would call them back to the TNA programming after they had received that experience or level of they felt comfortable with working the TNA style. Now, this hasn't happened very much recently. The only wrestlers I can think that have been sent down to work in OVW have been Shira and Bhupinder Gujjar. If you're enjoying this episode, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's free and it helps me produce fantastic videos like this. Also, if you subscribe, you get access to the fantastic catalog of previous episodes that I've done. Ring the bell for notifications on new videos that are being released. This hasn't been that successful in terms of a developmental system for them, as this system doesn't really see them actually using the developmental the wrestlers that they've signed to developmental contracts, such as Shogun Jackson Stone, Jack Price, Harley Hudson, Jason Hotch, and Mike D, who gained those developmental contracts by being crowned the winners of each the successive years gut check style tournaments. So apart from so most of these wrestlers haven't featured that much on TNA programming, apart from Jason Hotch, who is currently wrestles pretty frequently on TNA programming as part of the Good Hands tag team. But most of these wrestlers on developmental contracts are working in the independent scene to improve their skills. So not necessarily OVW or BCW. So I feel that TNA does need a developmental territory that is somewhat like NXT. So that it should develop the next generation of TNA wrestlers. So over the years, TNA has had its own versions of wrestling shows other than the main Impact or Explosion. So they've had Ring-Ka King, which was, I think, the closest thing that they actually had to a developmental system, as it was founded by TNA, but it was filmed in India, and it featured some uh, Indian homegrown wrestlers who admittedly did get some training in OVW. That's mainly because there wasn't um, a big professional wrestling scene in India at that time. But it also featured TNA wrestlers that weren't being used on TNA programming at that point in time as well. So like Scott Steiner, Chavo Guerrero, Abyss, Jeff Jarrett, like like it had established TNA household names um, in Ring Ka King, but again, it it it, the reason why it only lasted one season was because that the broadcaster in India didn't feel like it was going to be that successful of going forward, so that's why they didn't renew it any longer for any longer than a season. And it's been. I don't think it's been cancelled, but it just hasn't been. Nothing's been done in terms of starting up a second season of that show. But the gut check program or competition, it was initially part of TNA programming, like in the early days of TNA, like like talking about 2003 to 2004, when it had more like a tough enough type of style of the program, where wrestlers or potential wrestlers would be taken through drills by experienced wrestlers, much like they did in Tough Enough. And like at the end of the competition, or however, the winner would receive a developmental contract. But I haven't heard of many of the winners of the initial gut check program, and I don't know what they are doing now. But that version of gut check was ended, and then it was only brought back during the Hogan and Bischoff era. But it was incorporated into the TNA programming, like every like month or so, they would dedicate a segment or two to having a gut check, having wrestlers from like independent promotions, mostly OVW at the time, competing with current TNA wrestlers for a TNA developmental contract. But there were also judges that they had to impress as well, and it was the judge's decision whether that wrestler would receive a developmental contract or not. So it that seemed to work for a little bit, and it did work in nicely with the programming at the time. And it was also, and a couple of the winners were also involved in some of the major storylines of TNA at that time. So like not Garrett Bischoff, but Wes Briscoe was involved in the Aces and Eights storyline, and like going through he went through the gut check system as well, like the gut check competition, and yeah, so it was basically seen as a way to get more up and coming uh, younger wrestlers into TNA at that time. However, it would only last as a segment on TNA programming for like less than a year, and then it would be featured as events or part of the one night only events, when it was more like a competition, which were were held, it was just like a knockout style tournament, and the winner of that tournament was given a developmental contract to work in Impact. But then that ended as well in 2015, and then again it was they brought it back in 2020. It's under the similar lines of the original Gut Check back in 2003, 2004. And yeah, its first winner was Jackson Stone, who received a TNA developmental contract. Then TNA would continue to hold this style of Gut Check a couple more times in the subsequent years, namely 2022 and 2023. And each year that it was held, it had two winners. So in 2022, the winners were Jason Hotch and Jack Price. And in 2023, last year, the winners were Harley Hudson and Mike D. So in terms of last year's Gut Check winners, I think they're still wrestling in the UK scene. I'm either because they haven't got their papers to actually compete in Australia, or sorry, not Australia, in America. From what I've heard of both of the winners of last year's Gut Check, they are ready, pretty much ready to be incorporated into TNA programming. It's just that they must be waiting for the US visa to come through. And also during this time, TNA also had a British wrestling competition where British wrestlers would compete, like in a similar way to Gut Check. It was called British Boot Camp, and it ran for 2 seasons. So, like in the first season, it featured independent wrestlers from Britain, like Hannah Blossom, Holly Blossom, Marty Skrull, Rockstar Spud. That was in the first season. And it had the mentors or coaches being Al Snow, Doug Williams, and Rollerball Rocco, just taking on the mentor or advisor role. So the winner of season 1 was Rockstar Spud, and he was the most successful of any of TNA developmental wrestlers, as he was immediately thrown into a TNA programming, like in the Dixieland storyline, where he just excelled in those ones. And season 2 of British Boot Camp featured more wrestlers from the independent scene in the UK. However, the winner being Mark Andrews, and he would remain wrestling for TNA until the end of that contract. But also in that season, there was another wrestler, Grado, who was signed to TNA because of the pure connection that he had with the fans, and And that season's mentors were Gail Kim, Al Snow, and Samoa Joe. And Samoa Joe and Grado had a bit of a rivalry on that program, which basically was used to get Grado over and get the TNA fans behind him, and basically, yeah, earn him like use that as a way of giving him a contract. So TNA actually came close to having a WWE NXT style of developmental territory, as they as when Ring of Honor closed its doors during the pandemic years, a few of their wrestlers would appeared in TNA, and because the future of ROH was uncertain, but TNA actually put in an offer to buy the ROH company, but it is unknown if it was to gain access to their video library. But in the end, Ring of Honor was bought out by Tony Khan, and so I feel that this was a missed opportunity for TNA, because they could have bought Ring of Honor and signed some of the wrestlers that were under contract there, and then used and brought them over to TNA and featured them on Impact, but then they could have kept the Ring of Honor program or the TV show and kept that as the developmental show. But I don't. I think the reason why they didn't go with that is because Ring of Honor had such a massive history behind it, and it would have been a slap in the face to Ring of Honor fans, and it would have just turned them off TNA wrestling even more. So I think TNA definitely would benefit from having an official developmental territory of its own. Whether they start one up from scratch like WWE did with NXT, or if they buy a smaller, newer wrestling company and just turn it into their developmental system. It remains to be seen, but I definitely think that TNA should actually consider doing this if they're wanting to keep their wrestlers and have a definite pipeline for future generations of TNA wrestlers. So feel free, guys, to let me know what your thoughts on TNA having its own developmental territory are. All right, guys, until next time.